particularly the stories of women in the Quran and how they're told, and how that's actually different than how the stories of men are told in the Quran, and how the stories of women and men are told in historical texts, in biblical texts, in other religious scriptures. And really trying to appreciate what is the Quranic style. What is the style that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used to speak about particularly individuals in the Quran? What aspects of their struggles and their narratives were honed in on, so that we can then, of course, take away from it. When we listen to a story, what parts should we give emphasis to? And at the very end today, I'm going to really focus in on one particular story in the Quran, which is going to be the story of Musa alayhi salam. But particularly, this is going to be the story of Musa alayhi salam before he is an actual character. He's more of a prop. It'll be the origin of the story of Musa alayhi salam. We'll get into that in order to understand some of the mechanisms of good storytelling. And I do have with me today my assistants, so just keep that in mind. They will be distracting throughout. I will try to use them when I can. Right, Aya? Yeah. Okay, I'm good. So don't be distracted by them too much. But today we're going to dive right into the idea of women in the Quran. And this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a book I highly recommend by Dr. Saeed Ibrahim called Women and Gender in the Quran. And I put forward just a couple of the stories of women in the Quran and their general narrative. And what we're going to focus on, just like last time, was on archetypes. What is an archetype again? Does anyone remember? It's a pretty complicated definition, so not really expect someone to shout it out. But it's this idea of it is a type of personality or character that, having gone through their narrative, you feel like you've developed as a result of it. Meaning, it's this idea that when you hear an archetypal story, one is it's a story that's constantly repeated. But that itself isn't enough to be an archetypal story. It's a story that after having heard it, you as an individual and the community as a society will have grown in some way as a result. And why we really appreciate the Quran being archetypal stories is when you listen to the story of Musa alayhi salam and Khidr, it's not just a cool story. It is a pretty cool story. But it's not just a cool story. It's a story after which you start appreciating there's going to be many times in which someone who's knowledgeable comes across someone who's been given wisdom. And the person with wisdom oftentimes knows better how to navigate something than the person with knowledge. Having known that and saying it over and over again, an individual in a community grows as a result of that story. Does that make sense? That is an archetype. The Quran is full of archetypal stories. Dr. Saeed Ibrahim in this book. I'm going to first ask this question actually. Anyone read this book? Good. So I can ask a question and it's not, no one has cheated yet. How many women do you think are mentioned in the Quran? How many? One. So Maryam alayhi salam, right? And that's actually, that answer is not wrong, because if you're talking about women who are named in the Quran, you are correct. Maryam alayhi salam. The only one that's technically named, though if we're going to be, we can say Sheba, it's also named. So there's would be two, but there are very few women named in the Quran. That point is valid. But how many women are talked about in terms of their stories are given in the Quran? So we know the answer is more than one. 6. Okay. Anyone want to go with another number? So the 1 and 6. What else do we have here? 25. Why are you saying 25? That's probably a particular number.
I said 13, but someone said 6, so I had to go with.
So I thought you were going to say 25 because there's 25 prophets mentioned in the Quran, right? So in order to only be fair, 25 prophets are mentioned in the Quran, and all of the prophets, at least the majority opinion is all of the prophets were male. There are minority opinions that say that there were people who were given wahi from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that were women, and that's the classical opinion, but that will classify them as being prophets. So the majority is all prophets were men. Okay, so maybe that's why I said 25. Anyone else? Another number? 12. Are you saying that because I have 12 listed here? Okay, not bad. The number is 74. That there are 74 women referenced in the Quran. Individual women. This is not counting when a woman was mentioned multiple times. that are mentioned. But a key distinction is that oftentimes they are mentioned with what's known as a kunya or a nukya, which is another way of referring to them other than their names. And she says that itself is a. She's asking me to tell you about Raya the last dragon. Yeah, no. It's a cool archetype. But they're oftentimes referred to by someone else, by their attachment to a community, by an attachment to another person. And we're going to come across a couple of them today. We're going to talk about Musa. We're going to talk about Imra'at al-Fir'aun. We're going to talk about Ukht Musa. We're going to talk about Zawj. So we're going to talk about a couple of different women. Actually, we're going to talk about 4 women today. But all of them are referred to not by their names, but actually by an attachment that they have with it. So it's actually kind of interesting. But anyone surprised that 74 was the number that was arrived at? That's a lot, right? I'm not going to ask you to give me how many males are mentioned. I actually don't know the answers. I know 74 because actually somebody did written this. I have no idea how many males are referenced in the Quran. I would imagine it's probably about the same. It would be cool for it to be Allah. I don't know. So I'll do that for next week. But a couple of them that are mentioned that most of us know about is the idea of like Hawa, Eve. She's not given the name Eve in the Quran. She's actually not even given the name Hawa. That's from Hadith literature. She's generally just found as the spouse, Zawja Adam, the spouse of Adam. I already want to put a couple of distinctions here. In the Islamic tradition, her role is to be the support of Adam alayhi salam, to provide Adam alayhi salam companionship. Her role is never found in the Quran to be the one who caused him to make the mistake. That's actually not found within the Quran. When they both end up on earth, God never tells Hawa that you will now have the pains of childbirth as punishment. That's not our tradition. It's just one of the things that the Quran does is it retells the stories that have already been revealed to correct them. Wife of Nuh, alayhi salam, he's found. The wife of Ibrahim, alayhi salam, always called Zawj Ibrahim, is found. Aziz's wife, oftentimes given the name Zulaykha, found in the Quran. The mother of Musa alayhi salam, the wife of Musa alayhi salam, the sister of Musa alayhi salam, the adopted mother of Musa alayhi salam. We're really going to focus in on the story because, spoiler alert, but the story of Musa alayhi salam is filled with women who changed the nation. While the story of Yusuf alayhi salam is full of, interestingly enough, a story that's devoid of almost any mention of women up until Zulaykha. So it's kind of interesting how they're parallel. There's lots of parallels between the story of Musa alayhi salam and Yusuf alayhi salam. But anyway, Bilqis, the queen of Sheba, with the story of Sulaiman alayhi salam, the wife of Imran, Maryam alayhi salam, the mother of Musa alayhi salam, Isa alayhi salam, the mother of Maryam alayhi salam is found as well, the wife of Zachariah. And something interesting is the mother of Isa alayhi salam, Maryam alayhi salam. She's delivering the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a very different way than the typical delivery of the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And guess what? She gets backlash as a result of it. That's actually the opinion of Ibn Sina, in which he classifies her as a prophet because he said she did nothing different than a typical prophet. What does a typical prophet do? Deliver the words of Allah to the people. And what happens? The people reject them. Maryam alayhi salam delivered literally kalimatullah, the word of Allah as he's called in the Quran. Isa alayhi salam, and she faces backlash as a result. For him, that was enough to classify her as a prophetess, though that's not the majority of people. And then, of course, we have the wives of the Prophet, the other Prophet, the women who complained to the Prophets of Allah, the wife of Abu Dhahab and Pharaoh's hairdresser. These are all found also as well as women in the Quran. Why I wanted to put this forward is, of this list of women, are they primarily good or primarily bad? It's actually a combination. There's the good ones, you could say, Hawa alayhi salam, person of Jannah. Wife of Nuh, actually, no. She drowned. Sarah, the wife of Ibrahim, good. Aziz's wife, depends on who you ask. There are certain mufassir, certain commentators of the Quran that say that Yusuf alayhi salam eventually married her and she apologized. So there's actually a mixed opinion. Some say that she was transgressing, and others say she repented. We did a study of the story of Yusuf alayhi salam 2 semesters ago, was it? I forgot. So at some point at Rutgers, that's one of the debates we had back and forth. Did she at the end become a redemptive character, or did she at the end become someone who is thrown in jail as a result of her crimes? So ambiguous. Mother of Musa alayhi salam, of course, good. All of them good. Sister of Musa alayhi salam, good. Asya alayhi salam, definitely good. One of the first people to enter. One of the first people to enter Jannah is going to be the wife of Pharaoh, Bilqis. The general consensus is that she converted to Islam as a result of her interaction with Islam. The wife of Imran, of course, she's the wife of a prophet and it's spoken highly about. Maryam alayhi salam, of course, good as well. The reason I mentioned that is it's not like a 50-50 split, but there isn't a huge leaning one way or the other. The Quran seems to present this idea that women can have multiple roles. There's good, and then there's those who are not, are going to be the opposite. Versus, I have to call this out, women in previous scriptures that existed. I'm particularly calling out women from the Bible right now, but we can look at almost any previous religious scripture and we have a very different story. We have Delilah. I'm not sure how many of you have studied biblical studies. I probably should have put more details on them, but there's a story in the Bible called about Samson and Delilah. And kind of an odd story, but Samson is supposed to be a good person, starts visiting this woman of the night named Delilah. Characters in the Bible are weird. And he tells her the secret that his hair is actually what gives him power and strength. And she sells his secret out. And because she sells that secret out, Samson loses all of his power. And that's where that saying comes. You've cut my hair, so I'm powerless. Anyone know? I'm the only one who reads. Okay. But it's this idea, but the role that she played is one of a co-temptress. Salome, she's put forward as one of the key people that killed John the Baptist, actually would be Yahya in our tradition. And also she ends up marrying her brother. There's another really odd situation. So it's a really odd character. Queen Jezebel, her big flaw or her big thing that she's known for is she has a righteous spouse, but she's never able to leave idolatry. So she continues and offers herself up to the deity fall. Eve, I've already mentioned this, but the biblical narrative oftentimes, why do women get harder times on earth? The typical biblical theology was what? Because Eve tempted Adam, so because of that, Eve is going to suffer on earth. That's not, I want to make it clear, that is not the Quranic narrative in any way, shape, or form. Herodias, advisor for John's murder, and she's actually given the title of being an innocent. There's an archetype of women in literature that's called the innocent, that they don't actually do anything, but they suffer the consequences of everyone else. They don't project the plot forward anyway. All they're there for is to add emotional weight to something. And her thing is, she was in the council that decided that John's going to be murdered. And because of that, when her husband gets exiled, she gets exiled as well. Potiphar's wife, the temptress, is literally Zuleika, or the one who tried to seduce Yusuf. Well, she doesn't have a redemptive story in it. There's no apology that she gives. It's purely just that. Makkah, she's an overbearing mother who pulls her kids who were righteous. One, she kills one of them so the other can ascend to the throne, and she convinces him to be an idolater. Lot's wife and daughters, it's literally, one gets turned into the pillar of salt, and the daughters actually end up doing incest and being cursed as a result of it too. Atalia, overbearing mother, who kills her 3 kids so that her 4th can end up on the throne. She's considered the tyrant of Jezebel. And the only exceptions to that rule will be Mary. And we know what happened when that took place, that the theology became much more than an awesome person, but turned into almost like a divine figure of some sort. And then we have Ruth, who arguably ends up being a good woman from the book. Why I'm putting this forward is there should be a compare and contrast in these. I'm not saying the Quranic narrative is all women are these. That's not it. There are people on guidance and there are people who are not on guidance. There is a guided group and an unguided group. That seems to be the Quranic narrative. want you to look at the narrative that is presented here. That's not the narrative at all. There are very few, so much to the point where even characters that aren't, these are the notable ones that each have a chapter named after. That's why it shows these particularly. You'll even find in the story of Abraham. The Quranic narrative, if we have anything about Abraham's wives bickering with each other and saying, my son should be superior instead of yours, that's actually not part of the Quranic narrative at all between Sarah and Hajar. They're two wives of Ibrahim. There's no rivalry that really exists between the two of them. That's not emphasized in any way, shape, or form. The story of Yusuf, do we know anything about the mother of Yusuf and the mother of the brothers? I know some of you, when you were growing up, you were told that, like, oh, it's because they were from different moms or this. That's a biblical tradition that really focuses on it. You have an entire 3 paragraphs that focuses on why Rebecca was never liked because she was the handmaiden of the favorite wife of Jacob. Jacob had 2 wives and 2 handmaidens, and that's why there was a rivalry between the brothers to begin with. Does the Quran talk about that in any way? No, you know what the Quran focuses more on? One, it completely ignores actually any mention of the female characters in the story of Yusuf, but it focuses much more on how about the relationship that Musa's mother had with Musa's sister. It emphasizes that. So the Quran, part of its storytelling is to correct some, not just the stories themselves, but the attitudes that come as a result of the stories that have been presented in previous scripture. You guys following me? And then we can go continue on to like the roles of women in literature in general, though time-wise not nearly where I want to be. So we're going to go ahead and skip this, but you can even think about that in terms of like women in literature. Typically you have this idea of like, it's the damsel in distress, it's the love interest, there's all of these different kind of like roles that women play, and typically they're not used as a actual protagonist or antagonist or anything along those lines. If they are an antagonist, it's literally to just take away. It's typically bad animus to the protagonist. For those of you who were last week, we talked about the 4 major archetypes. That's usually what it is, or it's a supporting character that either is along for the ride, adds emotional weight to it, or just sways the character slightly. That's very different than the Quranic narrative as what we see today. And a quick recap of archetypes, which I will not do. The only thing I'll say is, what is the major goal? What do we say once again? A character or a personality that after having been exposed to their narrative, you as an individual or the society actually grows as a result of it. And we talked about the 4 major archetypes, which is the self, sometimes called the ego, the collective self, or the superego type situation, which is usually the goal that the ego is getting to. The animus that pushes them towards or against where the eventual goal, and then the shadow, which has the opposite goal. It's trying to keep the ego as the ego, never making them realize actually their true self as a result of it. I should have probably put a picture of the recap from last week, but now we're going to jump back into the women. One is appreciate once again some of these characters and how subversive to the trope that really is. That some of them are going to be like a supporting character. Some of them are going to be literally the people who carry the plot forward. And one thing that's interesting about each of the ones I listed particularly is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about them, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about them as an individual, not related to anything else in the story. Meaning that even if they're referred to as the mother of Musa, she has her own arc of development. Meaning she goes from struggling to obey Allah, obeying Allah, feeling like her heart is empty, to eventually Musa being returned to, feeling fulfilled, and having the coolness of her eyes achieved. She has an entire arc to her character. We're going to see that for a couple of the different characters, inshallah, in the story of Musa today. So with that, but before we do that, of course, I always have tangents before I jump into the story. We're going to look at Surah Al-Qasas, verse 28. Look at the first 15 ayat. That's my goal for tonight. If we can do that before 9:15, I'm good at that. If we can't, I want to get through with a couple of other things. And that's going to be the art of storytelling. As I said, we'd also talk about that. So one thing I want you to pay attention to before we move on is going to be look at the characters, the female characters, and What roles do they play? How do they develop? And how is that subversive to how typical presentations in scripture would have been about women? That's going to be one. The other is going to be to pick up on what I would call the tools of good storytelling. The Quran, of course, tells the best stories. And good storytelling typically has the ability of changing your idea about something, but also stimulating your mind as you're going through it, without this turning into a biology lesson. Your emotional state or your receptivity is typically controlled by two things. There's by hormones and there's by neurotransmitters, all right, the way your mind works. Hormones change the way you feel week to week in like a longer term basis. So that's why when we say like teenagers are being, like their hormones have kicked in, so their personalities are starting to change, that's actually true because that changes the way your brain actually works. And then there's neurotransmitters, which is on a moment to moment level. That if suddenly someone yelled at you unfairly, or one of you got a ticket, your cortisol levels would rise pretty significantly. Did that happen over a period of weeks? A period of like major, it's because of a single stimulus can suddenly elicit a response. That's a neurotransmitter. Does that make sense? So how you feel from a moment to moment basis, neurotransmitter. How you feel in like a general basis, much more control. I'm simplifying this way too much, but much more hormonal control. Are we good? One of the things that's quite interesting is good storytelling across the board tends to actually affect you at a neurotransmitter level, and actually it's generally been tracked. It's called the golden triangle of storytelling, that it actually involves, particularly, there are over 17 different neurotransmitters. Some of them are divided up smaller than others. Some also, that being way too simplistic, are between a hormone and a neurotransmitter. I'm not going to give you a quiz on this at the end of it, but the ones that are important, the golden triad is known as endorphins, serotonin, and oxytocin, meaning that these neurotransmitters, I'm not going to go through all of them, but endorphins are like that feel-good hormone. Meaning that what happens, they're like, there was suspense built up and then you finally got a relief of some sort. That's endorphins, like, ooh, I feel good. That's endorphins. Serotonin is oftentimes called the funny neurotransmitter. Why? Because it's kind of like makes you laugh. It's actually not about laugh, it's about being surprised and having the end of a surprise hit you. So it's typically ironic in some sort, but that serotonin is released when that happens. And the last one is oxytocin. That's that like warm, fuzzy feeling you get. It's called the connection. Meaning that when you connect with someone, this literally happens. The reason, one of the reasons we think that the Prophet encouraged shaking of hands was it makes animosity fall between people. Actually, we can now track this. That when someone makes physical contact with you, oxytocin is released, you feel way more connected to them. When someone smiles in your direction, you feel a little different, you're more likely to smile back. That's oxytocin being released. That's when those get released in a short amount of time, you're extremely invested. We can almost scientifically analyze and say, this makes a good story. And to prove that, oh no. Well, we'll talk through the beginning of it because the first minute's not really important. And is it audio from the projector? Is there? Okay, you can check that. The first first minute and a half isn't that important. But I want you to pay attention. And yes, I'm playing a Pixar movie, the beginning of a Pixar movie, but I want you to pay attention to some of the emotions that are being evoked in the very beginning of it, and tell me when you can start feeling when you start getting more and more invested. I promise you we're talking about the For those of you watching online, we are watching the first couple of minutes of time. That's for those of you who haven't seen it, I will narrate to you what's happening. Okay. But it's a very moving scene in the beginning where you have these two clownfish. They're funny. Okay. But you have these two clownfish that they just moved into a new neighborhood out the beach, and they're having this like conversation about they're excited about just about to be parents, and then they say some jokes to each other back and forth. And you're kind of invested already in the story a little bit. Spoiler alert to those of you who haven't seen this. It's been like 20 something years. Sorry. But what ends up happening is they swim out and they're talking, and it's kind of funny. They're not like naming their children. One of them, there's like 400 eggs. It's like we can name half of them Marlin Jr., half of them Coral Jr. Those are their names. And eventually it's like, I want Nemo. She says that to one of them. It's like, okay, name one. So it's kind of funny. It's kind of like random banter. That's what happens. And then suddenly what happens, we're about to get to it. Oh, they're talking about the names. I want one of them to be Nemo. It's like one can be Nemo, but the rest, I want most of those to be Marlin Jr. and Coral. The kids are loving it. And they're now getting into this idea of like, well, we're going to be parents. Can you believe it? And they're again having like a very heart-to-heart conversation with each other. And they're playing around. He's talking about how they first met. So it's supposed to get the feels going. And then suddenly, the beach is empty. Why? After he wakes up, he doesn't see his wife anywhere. All of the eggs are gone. Post it says, "You're my Nemo." Okay, enough with that. Reason I did that is one of the reasons that that's considered. Actually, it could have been way worse. I could have done the first 5 minutes of that's even sadder. Pixar is great at this, but one of the reasons you've been invested so quickly in the story is because it hits what's known as that what a good story does is within the first few moments. Within the first few moments, you get into being invested in the characters, having some sense of suspense, having some sense of funniness, so you relate to the characters more. Serotonin, funny, oxytocin, you're connected to them, and then endorphins, there's suspense of what's going to happen next. When all three of those get hit within a small amount of time, suddenly that's a good story. You get invested in it. All of us know people who are trying to tell you a story, but you can't keep up. Like you lose out, you lose attention. They've both jumped in too many directions at the same time. It just doesn't work. Why? Because actually this wasn't done. But of course, for lots of time, now that's all the story. We'll look at an example now for some of the process. It's going to be employ exactly those tactics, but even to a much more masterful degree. What I want us to do is not, we take stories in the Quran seriously because look, we can now prove it through how we understand storytelling. That's actually not it. It's more of to say we've become so accustomed to this type of storytelling taking place because these techniques that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala literally uses to tell a story, to make it have an emotional impact and take a lesson, have been used in other forms of media. And we are affected by that. If we can recapture those in order to appreciate how well they're done in the Quran, stories in the Quran become more alive as themselves. That makes sense? Now, we're going to jump into a story in the Quran. Literally, I had contemplated which story to use, and the answer was pretty obvious. The surah called story. Surah Al-Qasas is called story. So if there's going to be a surah that tells you a story, it's supposed to be told, it'll be Surah Al-Qasas. Starts off, as many surahs of the Quran do, boss in. Yes, I didn't do the visually, but already you start off with something real. Intrigue, because what? No one is ever going to know what these words mean. I kind of made this connection randomly, but this is sometimes with branding goes. You ever think about like in the beginning of when a movie starts? You saw the Paramount thing that goes around. Don't you oftentimes wonder, like, why? Like, why do they choose that as their brand? You see that lion roaring. You see, like, some of the creepy ones too. Like it shows like some random image and something like, why would they do that? That's actually a technique. That's actually employed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All this intrigue. Bossy. You're immediately supposed to be, I'm never going to know the answer to this question. That's not something that's been revealed. You have to kind of wonder, what is the reason? Allah, I don't know. These are the events of a clear book. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues. My screen is small, so here we go. نتلو عليك من نبأ موسى وفرعون بالحق لقومه يؤمنون. We're sending down to you the story or part of the story of Moses and Pharaoh in truth for people who believe. Getting introduced, where the subject matter is going to be this. Strangely enough, these are the two characters that are not going to be very significant for quite a long time in the story. But it's foreshadowing who's the story of it. إن فرعون علا في الأرض وجعل أهلها شيعا يستضعف طائفة منهم. Indeed, Fir'aun. And suddenly, just think about it this way. This is the whole story being introduced. Allah says, who's the story about? Musa and Fir'aun. It's almost like the title. Then what comes next? Fir'aun was on the earth. That's an odd way of describing someone, but immediately you're supposed to be thinking, what would someone on the earth look like? You almost think about like on a kingdom. He's like looking over his subjects. He's on the earth, quite literally. And then what else is about him? He would divide his people into groups. And one of them he really persecuted. So what's he known for already? Immediately we get a characterization of this. If we're looking at it from like a camera view angle, you're seeing him, and he's dividing people up into groups of people. You guys live here, you guys live here, you guys get this, you guys get this. He's dividing them up into many groups of people. We can almost talk about gentrification, like how different groups of people divide into different areas, but he doesn't treat them all equally, because that's all an obvious thing. Because sometimes you might think, what? You divide people up so that there's peace. No. He would make some of them way worse than someone else. You know why? Well, it's this intelligent in doing that. If all of the people had the same power as you, or had no power, or if everyone had no power and you had power, what would happen? They'd all overthrow you because they want power and you have it. But you know what he does? You guys have 5 points of power. You guys have 4. You guys have 3. You guys have 2. You guys have none. Now what happens? The zeros are never going to link up with the twos because why? The twos don't want to lose the power that they have. The fours want to be the right hand man of the one who has all the power. Why? Because they've been given a special position. Firaun, it's already his intelligence is described, and like his methodology is described. He would divide people up into many different groups. And to this one group, he would treat them the worst. He would kill their sons. And he would leave their daughters alive. At first, you think about that, and you're like, he would leave their daughters alive. Oh, at least he's merciful. He's not killing the daughters. In a warring situation in which power is being distributed from place to place and resources are being constantly reallocated, women whose protectors have been killed, leaving the daughters alive is not an act of mercy. It's an act of control. That's all it is. It's an act of control. War throughout history, that some of the worst atrocities take place when exactly this situation is that happens. Why I'm telling the story like this and adding more details? When the Quran tells a story, it tells you what to focus in on, but it doesn't tell the story for the first time because it expects that you've heard the story from others before. It expects that you've heard the story of Musa, but maybe this is the part you didn't pay attention to. These are the details that it fills in. Leave them alive. إِنَّهُ كَانَ مِنَ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. He honestly caused a lot of facade on the earth. Someone who hears the story was supposed to be, hey, I heard the story of Adam before, and in the story of Adam, the angel said what? I've seen beings like this that do facade on the earth. Allah uses the same thing. This is what facade looks like on the earth. People divide out each other, and they are merciless against each other. That's it. And he did this particularly to one group of people. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that comes in and says, وَنُرِيدُ أَن نَمُنَّ عَلَى الَّذِينَ اسْتَضْعَفُوا. We wanted to, it was our will to favor those that were oppressed in the land. وَنَجْعَلَهُمْ أَئِمَّةً وَنَجْعَلَهُمُ الْوَارِثِينَ. We wanted to make them models and make them the successors. A model society, a model civilization, and successors. Immediately you're like, wait, the people who are being oppressed, one will rise from them, or they will rise into being a model society. You're immediately supposed to be like, how is this going to happen? Remember we talked about the endorphins? Your sense of intrigue is supposed to kick in. And for those of you who studied any degree of sociology, can an oppressed group of people lead? The answer to that question is actually no, unfortunately. I know we don't want it to, but like that's not what happens. When someone's been oppressed over and over again, if you tell a child over and over again, you're never going to amount to anything. You're a failure, you're a failure, you're a failure. I know most of us would like to think what? That child's going to be amazing one day once they're out of their oppression. But you know what typically happens? They internalize it. And they start thinking, I'm a failure, I'm never going to amount to anything. You know what they start telling their children? You're a failure, you're never going to. You see how my point? It continues, it's a cycle. But Allah just said that's not what happened. Allah intended to do what? This oppressed group of people, we're going to make them leaders. And we're going to make them ones who inherit all that's power. They're going to, spoiler alert, they're going to struggle a lot along the way. Sometimes we think about why did the Bani Israel, why did they not listen to Musa alayhi salam? Right after, as soon as they were saved by Allah, why did they act the way they did? Generations of oppression do not go away overnight. The stories are also found to be realistic about how societies work. If a group of people have been oppressed for a long time, don't expect one generation to change it. How many generations does it actually take? I want to count 17 until they're given the kingdom. Continuing, but we're focusing back in on the story of the sons. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues, and to establish them in the land. I'm going to just speak the English right now because time is running short. And establish them in the land, and through them show Pharaoh and Haman, so both the political leader and the military leader, that their soldiers, Haman and their soldiers, what they feared. So another thing that's being understood here is why did Pharaoh do the crazy things that he did? He was actually always afraid of being overthrown. Allah said, we wanted to make his fears come to actual reality. Why was he oppressing people? Because he knows, like, I have no right to. There's no reason we have what we have. So we're afraid of losing it all the time. Allah says we intended to show them make their fears come to life. through the people that he's been oppressing the most. This is that grand scheme of suspense that you're supposed to be building. And then suddenly, وَأَوْحَيْنَا إِلَىٰ أُمِّ مُوسَىٰ أَنْ أَرْضِعِيهِ, and we inspired the mother of Moses. So this was like a national conversation. And then suddenly the story zooms in to a single mother. And God says to the single mother, feed your child, breastfeed your child. Suddenly it's like this massive chaos zooms in, one mother's struggle that's being found. But if you fear for him, right now, feed him. But if you fear for him, put him into the river. And don't fear and don't grieve. We'll certainly return him to you, and he will be amongst the messengers. Even in English, it's kind of beautiful because he will be amongst the messengers, or he will be also like, what's that mean? He will be returned to you. Like he will be a package that's given back. Already kind of foreshadowed that he's going to be okay. But it's kind of beautiful. It went from this national conversation to this individual mother who's, you're supposed to live like she is. I have this child, and I always imagine, why would Allah tell her to suckle her child? The order has been given out, one, kill all the sons. My child is not anywhere to be found right now, but kids, are they ever quiet, especially when you tell them to be quiet? If you tell them not to be quiet, they might be quiet. If you tell them to be quiet, forget it. That's not happening. You can only imagine this mother's frantically trying to hide her child. And she suddenly gets revelation that I should be feeding him, because that's the one time in which he does what? He doesn't cry. So she's feeding him. But then she's like, how long is this gonna last? A child on average sleeps like 20 minutes. Good, what do I do for the rest of the time? Allah gives her, when she's calm and she no longer has a screaming baby in her head, she goes, I can put him in a basket, just hold it, float him upstream, because at the very least, when I do this, I won't see him being killed in front of me. But this is where also supposed to be humanly thinking, what mother in their right mind is going to be putting this child in a basket? I know the first time I gave my daughter a bath, Afia was not calm at all. Filled up the little bath, like a rubber thingy, and like I was just starting the water. No, turn the water off before I put her in. Like, it's not gonna drown in an inch and a half of water. This isn't gonna happen. But mothers in water, they do not mix together. We're supposed to actually draw from that experience, right? But this mother is in such a desperate situation that what? She's thinking, sending my child off in this basket. And if anyone knows anything about the Nile River, what lives in the Nile River? Nile crocodiles, 27 feet long crocodiles. They're basically dinosaurs. Just live in that river. But she's being told, put him in. And Allah continues. Musa alayhi salam, baby Musa is floating down the river. And Allah says, and it so happened that Pharaoh's people picked him up. Another thing that I want us to appreciate here is one of the reasons the pyramids of Giza, they have the Nile River flowing to them. One is there's a whole theology to it, but the other is if you ever put anything in the water, the Nile flows north, it doesn't flow south. So what happens if you put anything in the river, if you try to run away, escape by sea, what happens? You get taken right up to Pharaoh's castle. That's exactly what happened to Musa. He gets taken upriver, goes right into the house of Pharaoh. This is where we're supposed to, remember I said irony is supposed to be one of those things that gets you invested in the story? You're supposed to be thinking, oh, he's gonna escape. But you know what happens? He doesn't escape. He goes right into the house. And Allah says, only to become their enemy and a source of grief for them. But surely Pharaoh and Haman were haughty. Haughty is simple, but they miscalculated. The one mistake that they made, they miscalculated this. What they thought was their source of strength will become their greatest weakness. That makes sense. Their source of strength is what? We've arranged such a system that what? No one can even run away from us. Because if they run away, guess what? They get taken to us. Allah's like, we actually didn't send Musa to like a foreign land and then come back and do this. Where did we send him? Right to the house of Pharaoh. And what else is happening? He's afraid of the Bani Israel, right? That they're going to rise up. And Allah's going to raise their savior in that house. So he gets picked up. And then we get introduced to character number 3 so far. We have the mother of Musa who's basically a prophet at this point. And now we have character number 3. وَقَالَتِ امْرَأَةُ فِرْعَوْنَ, the wife of Pharaoh, she's in a very terrible, precarious situation. Why? She's married to the guy who just ordered all the babies get killed. Who's going to be happy in that type of situation? Allah will describe her in other places in the Quran that she is amongst the most perfect created beings. This is this woman, and she's married to what? Fir'aun. Also want us to appreciate archetypes here for a second. Remember I said one of the reasons you're supposed to, or the stories of the Quran, they're supposed to change our perspective of how we see people. If someone has a terrible husband, does that mean they're terrible? You're supposed to be thinking, I've been reading since a child the story of the wife of Pharaoh. And she was amazing, and her husband is literally the worst man ever. I can't judge someone by their spouse. I can't. Because why? These are literally supposed to change my reality and recalibrate it to what's actually right. So she's going through a terrible situation, but Allah said, even in that moment, this is where there's going to be a critique of. Sometimes we think of if the system is bad, everyone in it is going to be bad as well. She actually does the most good that she can. Allah captures. She says she calls over the child, the babies are in her arms now. She takes the baby over to Pharaoh. And Musa alayhi salam is actually found elsewhere in the Quran that he's not just a normal baby, he's like a really cute baby. Allah actually says that we made him beloved to anyone who saw him. So I think that just means he's a really cute baby. I don't know if the miracle is, but I'd like to see that in general. But he's a really cute baby. So she goes carrying this baby to this person she does not like. Allah wonder why she got married to him. I highly doubt it was her choice. But she takes him over and she goes, you'll be the coolness of my eyes, the comfort of my eyes. The coolness of the eyes is an interesting expression that's found in the Quran. That when you're feeling the worst forms of grief, the thing that brings you relief. It's supposed to be that moment that from classical literature, it's actually when a person is traveling in the desert and they're being pelted in their eyes with hot sand. And suddenly they see either a river, like a source of water or a cave. They're like, I can be taken away from the source of grief that's really making me cry right now. That's the coolness of my eyes. She's like, my life is a storm. But this baby, see this baby? It's Pharaoh. Picks him up. She goes over to Pharaoh and goes, this is the coolness of my eyes. I feel comfort. Walak, and to you. Part of how we know this relationship is bad, what could she have said? She could have said, this will be the coolness for both of our eyes, but she doesn't want to say that. She doesn't even in a sentence want to be associated with this vile human being. What does it not mean? Walak. And she's showing him this child. And Pharaoh, this is the other part of this, is some historical references. The Bani Israel didn't look like the children of Israel. I mean, the Bani Israel didn't look like the people of Egypt. They actually looked different. Their skin color was different. They would have had a wheatish complexion versus the Egyptians would have been a lot darker. Because this is pre-marrying into Roman bloodlines. That's a whole other story. We'll talk about that later. Maybe. So they look at it, it's like, this child doesn't look like ours, it's one of theirs. But she's holding him and she says, he's going to be the coolness of my eyes and yours. And then she continues, don't kill him. And maybe she's looking at Fir'aun and Fir'aun's looking at this baby, like really intrigued by this baby. That looks so cute. And she's thinking, maybe I can go a little bit further. Maybe he'll be of use to us. Maybe he's going to provide some service to us. Maybe he can be like a servant to us. And Pharaoh's maybe looking like, yeah. But he's still intrigued by how cute this baby is. Oh, or maybe we can keep him as a son. I want you to think about how much that escalated just now in the middle of a conversation. And this, I want you to appreciate how intelligent this woman is. She started the conversation, don't kill him. Maybe he'll be a servant. Maybe he'll be our son. You see how much that escalated? Because she knows, looking at it, okay, this is a time which I can quickly make a request. There's a lesson in here somewhere. I don't know if I want to tell you to learn how to manipulate people, but there is a lesson in here somewhere of kind of how intelligent this woman is, and Allah talks about that particularly. And Allah then comments, and they were unaware of what was happening. What's happening? This is who Allah used to do what to destroy Fir'aun. And Fir'aun just did what? He just agreed to adopt him as a son. Remember I said irony? Irony is supposed to suddenly hit us. Then Allah continues. And the heart of the mother of Musa, وَأَصْبَحَ فُؤَادُ أُمِّ مُوسَى فَارِغًا. The heart of the mother of Moses was empty. Scene suddenly shifts back after the story of Moses has been taken care of a little bit, going back to the woman who actually put it down. And something beautiful here is it goes from woman to woman. Why I want that to be appreciated is, anyone know what the Bechdel test is? It's a test of common literature in which you test how often a female character talks to other female characters without talking about a male character. And they looked at it, and it's a test that they developed because they realized that all stories, women are just supporting characters, they never just talk about each other, or to each other, or about anything other than the male characters. They're like cutaways. I think it's interesting the story of Musa that goes from one female character to the next, to the next, to the next. Just kind of interesting. I'm not saying it never does that with male characters. Of course it does. I'm saying there's balance there. Because we'll talk about how this is different from the story of Yusuf, which primarily does focus on the male characters. But anyway, the heart of the mother of Moses was empty. That she would have almost given away his identity had we not reassured her heart and have faith in Allah's promise. She was about to say, my baby, where'd he go? I put him down. Someone please let me find him. You can imagine. Remember I said oxytocin is required? You're already feeling for this mother who just did what? She lost her baby. Losing your child. And at first you had resolve because you were like, no, this is a good plan. But you don't have your child in front of you. Her heart is empty, and she would have just revealed the whole plan. But Allah said, we strengthened for her heart. And she said, as she got strengthened, as she's watching this baby go away, she says, she says to the brother of Musa, we'll see. The story is called the Qasas, ability to recount step by step. See, she says as this baby is floating away, we shift back to the Musa floating in the river. She says to this child, go follow your brother. I was about to use my daughter. I don't know if she's still around. Hi, are you here? No, that's Suhba. Okay. But my daughter is 6 years old right now. If I tell her to do something, do you think she does it? She'll eventually get to it, but you know what she'll do beforehand? If I ask her, I gotta go get my shoes, you know what she'll do? Which ones? The black ones? The slippers? The dress shoes? If I go, I gotta go eat something, you never told me what to eat. It's like me, like, that's just what kids do, especially little girls. Mashallah, they love talking. But this mother goes, follow him. And you know what this little girl does? Doesn't ask any questions. She goes and does it. You know how crazy that is? And also, what she told him is something she can't do. What she told her to do, she can't do. Because think about it, if he's in the river, follow him. What does that mean? I can't. And she said, we'll see. He follow him step by step. You want me to swim? There's alligators in there. She doesn't do any of that. Allah captures. So she watched him from a distance while they were unaware. So she's like sneaking and tailing this. I literally think like Assassin's Creed style. Like she's tailing this this basket floating, and she sees, oh my gosh, it just went into Pharaoh's place. But she's still able to follow. Meaning, this is an intelligent child. Subverting a couple of tropes, right? Like this woman is really smart and intelligent and is able to listen to her mother, also has a really amazing relationship with her mother, and her mother says something and she does it right away. You're supposed to be surprised by that. Then Allah continues, and we caused him, Allah shifts right back to Musa, we caused him to refuse all of the wet nurses at first. So his sister suggested, so now it goes back to his sister, shall I direct you to a family who will bring him, who maybe knows how to feed this child, will bring him to you and take good care of him? But that's what the English says. The Arabic actually is a little bit more. It actually translates to, فَقَالَ هَلْ أَدُلُّكُمْ عَلَىٰ أَهْلِ بَيْتٍ. Can I tell you about the people of some house? And not my house, because if she had said my house, we know immediately. This is your brother? He's an Israelite. We need to get him. No, she goes, I think I know of a house. I think I know where it is. And those people, I might know where the house is. Yes, no. There's some people, I don't know them that well. لَكُمْ وَهُمْ لَهُ نَاسِحُونَ. And they take really good care of kids. This is a smart little girl. We're getting the archetype of like this really intelligent little child that has done what? Is able to navigate first worlds, not being caught, and is now also leading us on. Remember I said irony or serotonin release is something that gets you invested in the story? This is actually meant to be fun. You're supposed to see this child outsmarting what? The guards of Pharaoh. All of the things of Pharaoh, they can't do what? Recognize that this child is actually doing them. And Allah SWT then continues, and we returned Musa to his mother so that her eyes would be cool. Suddenly, you have Musa returned to what? His mother. And now, what continues most of the story, what at that, so that she would be put at ease, like her eyes would be cool, and that she would grieve, and that she would know that Allah's promise is always true. But most people do not. Very next, so she's returned back to him, and there's a sense of relief. And now what has happened? This went from, the title card was what? We're going to show Haman and Fir'aun what they feared. We're going to cause the Bani Israel to inherit the earth. And what do we have so far? We're invested in the mother of Musa, the sister of Musa. We now have, where's Musa going to grow up? His mother is going to be paid to feed him. And is going to get residence in the household of Pharaoh. And then Allah continues, وَلَمَّا بَلَغَ أَشُدَّهُ وَاسْتَوَى آتَيْنَاهُ حُكْمًا وَعِلْمًا. And when he reached full strength and maturity, we gave him wisdom and knowledge. وَكَذَلِكَ نَجْزِي الْمُحْسِنِينَ. This is how we reward those who do good. Suddenly, if this was a movie, not that I would recommend it, we turned it into one. You know how like that Lion King, like being raised moment? Suddenly you see a full-grown Musa in the palace. And you have to show what? Intelligence and wisdom. He has both of them. Do spoiled brats normally have either of those? No. He's got both of them. And he's been raised with the best education. And he's been raised in the household of the place that he's going to overthrow. And then we cut off to another portion of the story. Why I mentioned this? One is to look at some of the female archetypes here. The mother of Musa, we could make the argument here that Allah talked about overthrowing an entire nation. Then zoomed in on what? One mother doing her job. Word association is very important. Entire nation being overthrown. A mother feeding her child. There's something powerful about that already. That a mother raising a proper child enough to change a nation. Don't worry about anything else. Already kind of there. Imra'at Fir'aun, when we go through this, it's almost station time. Imra'at Fir'aun, wife of Pharaoh. Woman in a terrible position. Married to the biggest tyrant this world has ever seen. Doesn't matter. She can still be one. She can be a part of the solution to this problem. Not part of the cause, not part of the evil. She's actually part of the solution. There is a role for every person to play. Sometimes put forward roles. You're in an unfortunate situation, too bad for you, you can't do to change it. Even from the most unlikely places, aid will come. That's how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala arranges things. No one is powerless. No one has to be, even if they're associated with the main shadow of the story, Fir'aun, doesn't matter. You can still be an animus for good. Mother Musa, wife of Pharaoh, Ukht Musa, sister. Everyone underestimates what children. What's she going to do? Why is she mentioned? This story isn't even mentioned at all in the Bible. She's not even a character until way later. Her name is Mary, Maria, actually. She's mentioned way later in the story, like on Bani Israel, and it's actually seen as a force of misguidance. Narrative. But Quran goes from the get-go, Musa was supported. Part of why he was saved was because of this sister. She was there. She was the mechanism that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used to have what? Musa taken back to his mother. so he could be raised properly, and his household with guidance and faith. His faith was maintained, and his mother's iman was rewarded right away. Bunch of archetypes out of there. Eventually, we're going to have the conversation of what's the next major female character in the life of Musa. He's going to get married. It's the only marriage that's like already made in the South as well. Why I want us to look at that is, well, we'll end with this, comparing the two longest stories of the Quran. Next week, we'll talk a little bit about the story of Yusuf. Yusuf Islam's story, within literally the first couple of ayat, 4 major women are introduced. Story of Yusuf Islam. Is there any mention of his mother? Any mention of his sister? Yusuf Islam. Brothers are mentioned. Father is mentioned. A father figure is mentioned. You have one. An adopted father almost mentioned. All of him, his story is going to be what? Focused on men in the story. Both of their parents may be lying. Besides Sam, she doesn't say that she may be lying to have her son return. But she probably does, and within what? The next feeding, she's back with her son. Yaqub Islam will lose his son too. They'll make the rock. How many years pass? 40? Well, what, 30, 40? His son is returned. Parallels there, they both come back. One leaves Egypt because of something he did. The other one, what happened? He leaves Palestine and ends up in Egypt because of something someone else did. We'll go over many more of the lessons in inshallah, the parallels between them next time, but I'm hoping we got a bit of a glimpse of storytelling in the Quran, how it actually is supposed to be something that gets to be.
That laptop looks different than yours.
It does. It does. Thank you.
The one I did that.
No, that's okay. Okay. Next, a little bit of glimpses, inshallah, into storytelling techniques that are used and how, once we are aware of them, 2 things will happen. One is we'll appreciate the stories of the Quran more, but second is also when we're talking about telling stories that impact us, we're supposed to appreciate Allah took the time to really make a story appealing, to make us invested in this story, to shift from one character to the next, to focus on not just the details that happen, but their emotional states, what situation they were in, how they described things. That's what makes the story meaningful. When we tell stories and hear stories, that's what we should be honing in on as well. So it becomes a transformative experience as a result, rather than just being performative. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us amongst those that appreciate and are affected by the stories of Allah and are affected by the stories that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exposes us, both our own and those that are found around us. I mean, Sorry about that.